Okay, we start this like most Windows classes with an overview of how great it is. And the overview really is kind of a critical part of this because it goes through the different editions that are available so that you can pick the one that's right for whatever you're doing. What we're going to do in this class when you do the install, pick the Enterprise Edition because since A, we're not going to use it more than the 3 renews, and B, because it's an educational install, we don't have to pay any more for it. But if you're actually buying these things, you need to look and see what the pricing is and buy the system that fits the wherever you're installing it. And honestly, would that be Enterprise in most cases? If the company expects to grow, probably, because it has some more capability. The biggest more capability that it has is, I think, is memory management, because you're limited in the standard edition to how much memory that you can use. And I told you before, when we put in this new server, that kind of happened to us. They told me to put in standard server and whatever the amount of memory. We've got 96 gig in it, while it would manage like less than half of what was available. So we put on Enterprise and no problem. Enterprise is a huge, and we'll get to those specific numbers as we go through this thing. So the objectives: identify the key features of each Windows 2008 edition. And when we do the key features are always going to be everything that's in the one above it plus these. So once you get what's added, it's not going to be that much more. Understand client systems that can be used in Windows Server 2008. They're going to tell you Windows 7, and we just finished the Windows 7 course, so you're kind of familiar with that. Identify important general features of Server 2008. Plan a 2008 networking model. You'll do that in the lab portion that goes along with this class. Between the two, you're going to get hopefully enough practice that you feel relatively comfortable with this. And you should feel comfortable with it. How hard is it to install? There are people scared to death to even do an install. There are more people that are even more scared to install Active Directory. Well, Active Directory is just a matter of getting DNS to working right, and I'm going to say that word lots and lots and lots. DNS is absolutely critical to Active Directory. The way they're going to have you do it, not such a big deal because you're only going to have one server. If you have multiple servers, really big deal. Okay, plan the 2008 network model. Implement networking protocols. This particular one's got a number of slides on networking protocols that I'm going to click through because you already had networking twice and routing twice, so you should have an idea of what the networking protocols are. We're still using IPv4. We're still using IPv4 in the U.S. Keep in mind, though, that Windows internally uses some IPv6 functionality to do some communication, to do some things. So you don't really necessarily want to turn IPv6 off. Just leave it alone, let it do its own thing. It'll get an IP address. It'll do some communication using the IPv6 protocol. We already kind of talked about that, different styles of operating systems for different business needs. How big is it? How much memory do they need? What kind of applications are they running? What kind of expansion plans does the company have? 8 versions. The Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, the Web Server, Datacenter, Itanium, and Standard Edition without Hyper-V. And you actually have the Enterprise Edition without Hyper-V also. The ones that we're really focused on as networkers are the Standard Enterprise, maybe the Web Server if you're only going to run a Web Server, if you're going to run a Web Server farm, because it doesn't cost as much. Honest to goodness, if you're going to run a Web Server farm, what you going to use? You going to use a Windows Edition? Maybe. Probably most of you, since you've had the Linux classes or will have, would just go run Apache on a Linux server. if you were going to buy a dedicated web server. Because to buy a dedicated web server from Linux costs you about no dollars and no cents, right? So whichever. All of these other editions are going to have IIS available on it. So that's one of those, if you're doing something else and you kind of just, okay, we want a web server to run on it, yes, we're going to do that. The one that we're running for the virtual machines, run a web server, it's running other things, obviously. The primary thing that we're running it for is virtualization. So the virtualization service is its prime function in life. The domain controller's primary function in life is to authenticate you. And that's basically what they do is, yep, you're who you claim to be because you got your password right. The file server's primary function in life is to provide files like the one that I'm using here. It comes off of the file server. It also functions as a print server, two roles that are running on that file service and print service. So depending on what we're going to do, and that's when we talk about expansion, what are we going to do? What is the company going to do? How big of a resource does it need? If you get down into the Datacenter edition, you're talking big time here. Well, what Datacenter was designed to do was but to be the equivalent of a mainframe, to be able to put up to, I think, like 64 machines, processors, not cores, processors into a cluster. So that's available there. Itanium-based, if you have Itanium-based, an Itanium-based system. And then you can get the standard and the enterprise with or without Hyper-V. A little bit different price. If you, and we'll have these things, when you buy the standard edition with Hyper-V, you get one additional license. You get to license one virtual machine. Enterprise edition, you get a license for virtual machines without additional licensing costs. If you buy the data center version, notice I'm doing the whole lecture here, the data center edition, you get unlimited virtual machine licenses. So if you're going to put in 1,000 virtual machines, you probably would want data center. Data center is not something that you go out on the internet and buy. You're usually going to buy it already installed on the hardware because it really does need to be tested. It's something that's not something to just go and install. Now, having said that, when you do your install, the DVD that you're going to use is Data Center Standard and Enterprise. It has Data Center there. A friend of mine is at a corporation that's a really major Microsoft user, and they needed a new edition, so they sent him a Data Center edition. Not that he really wanted Data Center, but they sent it to him, I guess, just to see if they could get him to use that. Enterprise without Hyper-V, Data Center without Hyper-V, depending on what you're going to do. Each of the editions comes without it. The standard, the most basic basis for the other versions, everyday needs of a small to large business. This, again, depends on, I think, the role, the function of the server. What are you going to do with it? If you're going to have something that's really memory intensive, if we're going to run a bunch of virtual machines on it, probably not going to be so very good because we're going to be limited in those things. 32 and 64-bit machines. It supports file and print sharing, network services, application, and other sharing application. Applications is the new name for a terminal service, application server. Terminal server, essentially the same thing. Actually, they call it remote apps. They don't call it terminal server, still there. Remote applications, where you can install remote applications, virtualize your applications so that the applications are actually running on the server instead of on the desktops. Back to what do we want to upgrade. Multiprocessor, symmetric multiprocessing, fewer processors than are in the Enterprise Edition, but it supports them. Compatible with the .NET framework and the Microsoft Visual Studio.NET. So Hyper-V virtualization environment, and hopefully by using virtualization, and we've said enough about it, that yes, it has some real advantages. Costs, by using fewer physical machines, you still have to license each one of the servers, except for the one that you get for free and the 4 if you use the Enterprise. You have to buy licenses for all these things. Only runs on 64 64-bit computers. Hyper-V only runs on 64-bit computers. So if you're going to run Hyper-V, then you got to have a 64-bit. If you're going to run a virtualization software, virtual PC, Virtual Server 2005 R2, which is what, again, we use to virtualize to you, those will run on either a 32-bit or a 64-bit. And they have 64-bit editions of those that you install on your 64-bit hardware. Enterprise, mid-size, and large organizations with scaling needs, 64-bit and 32-bit. An addition here enables clustering. Clustering allows us to use multiple front ends to access a single database. When we talk about clustering, they're talking about database clustering here. There are two types. One is load sharing clustering, which if you have multiple interfaces or multiple locations to access a web site or something like that, we could do a load sharing where we go from one to the other back and forth. This allows contact to a database, a shared database. If one goes down, it automatically shifts to the other machine. Hyper-V also allows that for virtualization. You can do clustering for virtualization so that if one of the machines goes down, you still have access to all your virtual machines, managing your virtual machines, but they run on a common storage system. Supports hot add memory. This means that you can add memory to the hardware while it's running. Seems a little iffy, kind of, sort of, doesn't it? Better not short it out. And I have seen that happen once before. Fault-tolerant memory sync. Microsoft Meta Directory services, and a Meta Directory is kind of a directory about the directory, just kind of what's going on with these things. The web server itself, we kind of already talked about deploying web services and applications. It's like all the other ones, supports the 32 and the 64-bit systems, used to manage directory resources via hosting, cannot be used to manage directory resources via Active Directory. In other words, you can't put Active Directory on this. And opinion here, if you really look into these things, I think you're going to find that these web servers are kind of like a souped-up version of the client. The Windows Server 2003 web version, to me, was kind of a souped-up version of XP. This one's kind of a souped-up version of Windows 7. The reason is these machines allow 10, that I think it's that way, these machines allow 10 SMB connections, but you can have unlimited web connections. So, and that was one of the characteristics of a client, was that you can have 10 remote connections to it. So they just put a full version of IIS into, I think, something that's at least very similar to the client. The data center environments, mission-critical apps, very large databases, high availability, information requiring high availability, and support for clustering up to 16 computers. The clustering, earlier cluster was 4 computers, I think, four for the database clustering. 16 in this one. RAM capabilities identical to the Enterprise Edition. And the Itanium 64-bit processor, more instructions per processor cycle. It's a faster. And I thought, honestly, that they were not going to do an Itanium version. You have to get the Itanium processor, obviously, for these to work. RAM, 2 terabyte maximum for RAM. That's a lot of memory.
A lot of RAM.
Huh?
Really freaking.
But if you're going to buy these things, and I haven't looked, and maybe somebody have, at the price of Itanium, if you're going to pay the price to do this, you're going to have the highest end of hardware that's available. So you would expect those kinds of things. Hot add memory and processors. So you can add processors while the system's still running. Hot replace processor. If one goes down, you have to unload it, do some other things, and there should be some instructions to do that, but you can replace the processor while the system's running. Why do we want to do that? When we reboot a server, how long does it take? When you reboot your virtual servers, how long does it take? I know longer than you want, but how long does it take? A couple minutes maybe? When we're talking about these machines, you may be talking about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. How often do people reboot their mainframes? Like never?
Never, yeah.
When you're talking about a system that big, you're not talking about doing a 5-minute or reboot. We've had some servers that had enough services on them that even here with the services that were running probably would take 15 to 20 minutes to reboot. And I thought that was slow. And those were not anywhere near the capacity that we're talking about here.
Last year, whenever Cata came out from Blizzard, Cataclysm, for Warcraft, they had one of their servers crash, and it was down for like 6 hours.
Yeah.
So
6 hours.
Bad.
Yeah, very bad. 6 hours. And when they talk about that's the kind of thing that you would use the data center server for, if you were going to do that. I don't know, and you don't really see. I don't see at least because I haven't looked that hard. A lot of information about how well is they sharing, but I'm not sure that a lot of people are going to put their mainframe on a bunch of PCs or a bunch of servers, not PCs but servers. Maybe they will. Server 2008 version without Hyper-V, and again in the without Hyper-V costs a little bit less, but if you're ever going to virtualize, you get the licenses with the Hyper-V, and that might make it worth saving. Okay, server without Hyper-V, determine, and you've done this before, right-click, and yeah, what have you got, what version have you got. By the way, the one that you're going to install, Server 2008, already has Service Pack 2 in it, so you shouldn't have to put any of those things on, and I ask you to go ahead and disable automatic update when you get it installed, because instead of doing an update and then booting, update, booting, we're not going to keep them that long. Yes, in reality, would you have them update? Absolutely. In the environment that we're in, is it necessary to have them update? I don't think so. Just don't give each other viruses. The client access the resource via another computer, via network or direct cable. Been there, done that. You do that on a daily basis. The client machine, the one that you're setting that access resources on the server itself. Workstation has its own CPU, does its own processing. Server 2008 has gone further into the virtualization world, not just virtual machines, but also virtualizing applications. Virtualizing applications is really just something that's been available for a long time. They made it quite a bit easier in that we could install Microsoft Office on the server and give you access to it. It would appear to be on your local desktop, but it actually would be running on the server. The advantage to that is if you're sitting in the class, you'd be running a version of Microsoft Word that was on the server. You went home and you could connect to it. You'd be running the same version of Word. You'd be saving the documents in the same location. We're going to more of a model of you can't get away from work. Have you noticed that? All the fancy phone stuff and the apps and just being able to do it from wherever you are. Total cost of ownership is the full cost of owning it. The server 2008 and Windows Vista or Windows 7 reduces the total cost of ownership. These are, again, Microsoft's words, not necessarily mine, but it's everything that you have to buy. One of the things that some companies are doing and some companies are offering is instead of buying servers and having physical servers sitting over in the NOC, they're buying cloud space, servers in the cloud that they can manage your own servers, put whatever apps you want on it. And you don't have to have a full IT staff. You don't have to maintain physical servers. You don't have the power, you don't have the cooling, you don't have a lot of things. And that's, again, back to the advantage of virtualization. We reduce all of those costs whenever we virtualize machines. 2008 systems, domain and work group. The domain, Windows 7, ideal for networking. Windows 7 does work very nicely in the domain environment as long as you have enough resources to put on it. When you start putting them on machines in the work environment, if your company is one that has the license to do so, the Windows 10 PC is also a good client. There's one of them running in the library if you ever want to look at it, one of the summer ones. It's a lot less than the full version of Windows 7, but it takes a lot less resource than Windows 7. I was going to use it for the virtualization, but then they said it's not really designed to virtualize. It's only designed to go on lesser hardware. And when I did put it on, there wasn't much advantage to it. That domain, Active Directory is just simply a database. At its heart, Active Directory is just an LDAP database. And you can use it as an LDAP database. You ever think about when you log on to Moodle? How does it know what your Active Directory password is? Did you ever think about that one? It does, doesn't it? How does that happen?
It's stored somewhere?
It's stored somewhere. In Moodle itself is a configuration that you can put in a user that has the authority to read the Active Directory database and tell it to read the LDAP, the Active Directory database. So there is some consolidation you can do here. There is also some Unix compatibility services that you can put on so that you can use it more easily, more readily in conjunction with Linux. But it's at its heart is honestly an LDAP database. Groups users, computers, folders, and other network resources so that we can share. We can do all of the things that we want. Active Directory is the thing that controls what you have access to. Can you get onto the network, and then once you get onto the network, what do you have access to? The subsystem for Unix-based applications is available to support Unix and Linux clients, makes them more compatible with this thing. Server Manager, and these are some of the features, and I guess I'll go faster because one of the first things they're going to have you look at is Server Manager. It is a new tool. It works very well. It will open, unless you tell it not to, every time you start your machine. You can tell it not to. And then if you need it, it's in the administrative tools. So it's not like, oh, I've got to go figure out where this thing is. If I tell it not to open it, it doesn't pop up every time. So you can turn it off as a checkbox, don't open when the server restarts. It's up to you. You can do that. Security, there's a security configuration wizard which makes it easier to do this, and I think this came around either Service Pack 2 or Service Pack 3 on Server 2003. It is available for Server 2003, but not in the original. And if you can't find it in the administrative tools, try something real clever. Start like SCW, Security Configuration Wizard, at the run line. Clustering. We've talked about clustering, and again, two types of clustering, load sharing clustering and database clustering. When they talk about clustering, they're talking about sharing a database and have front ends that access the database, SQL servers. Enhanced web services, Windows Server Core. This is new in Server 2008. This is really cool. This is a server that presents a much smaller attack service. This is a server that doesn't have a GUI. This is a server that has one option at the start, which is command prompt. Once you get it installed, it is more efficient. Doesn't need as much hardware, doesn't need as much anything. And they have, when Chris put the, I guess they were putting in R2 servers, core R2 servers as domain controllers, which is kind of a pain. But they do now have a menu that help you configure this thing. When it first came out, the first time I did one, they said, reading on the internet, oh, there's this menu out here, it's the greatest thing in the world. You know, except the guy that created the menu withdrew it before I could get a copy of it. but apparently they're putting it into the systems now, so it's not as difficult. But you have to do it at the command line. The net shell command is one of the primary things that you would use to configure it. Putting Active Directory on is kind of like you need an answer file because there is no GUI. Once you get it installed, you can manage it remotely from the tools. Like if you want to add users, you would just manage it remotely and add users. What you don't want to do is a remote desktop. If you do a remote desktop, you get the command prompt. You want to manage it remotely with users. Windows PowerShell, to me, is kind of it's not really, but kind of a souped-up version of DOS. It has a lot of little commandlets in it. We're not going to make you PowerShell experts, but PowerShell makes scripting more powerful in the Windows system. Virtualization, been there, done that, right? Virtualization is available at Hyper-V in the versions that support Hyper-V. Server 2005 R2 is the one that we use to run it as run virtualization as a piece of software. Reliability, and that probably is one of the things that's improved. I think that each new release of server has become more reliable than the release before it. NT4 was kind of not very good. NT4's uptime was 7 days. You were supposed to reboot those servers every 7 days. 2000, they said, oh, we don't really know. 2000 was better. 2000 had some issues. 2003, big improvement on it. 2008, a big improvement over 2003. Multitasking and multithreading. Multitasking, we can have more than one application running, and multithreading is we can have more than one part of a program running at the same time. Multithreading to me is you're out driving with your buddies in your car and you run out of gas. All of you push would be a multi-threading. If one of you push, that would be a single thread. So you're all accomplishing an objective, a function, a service, and you're doing it together. You're sharing the load. Server manager, and again, we're going to go through some of these things relatively quick because they're going to have you do a lot of this. Take a look at it. Go through in the activities what's there. Just that it's there. It's new. Configure the desktop, do all those things, and when you get it installed, ask you to do a couple of things, like turn on remote desktop, put an IP address on it, those kinds of things. Using Server Manager because it's there and you need to know what it's about. Configure server, security server roles, and add and remove features, and you're going to have to do that. They have a lab to do something in PowerShell, and I think that if yours winds up the same way mine did, when you get there, PowerShell's not there. You're going to have to go into the features and add the PowerShell feature. PowerShell was available in Windows Server 2003 through a service pack, but when I tried to upgrade my Windows 2003 server, I found out that you can't upgrade a 2003 server to 2008 if PowerShell is installed. So you have to take it out. And I had done something really clever, like deleted all my uninstall files because I was running out of disk space. What I finally did was just go delete the directory, and it said, okay, you can do it now, so, for whatever that's worth. Network access protection, I think that they alluded to that in the Windows 7 course. What network access protection does is allows us, the administrator, to check them, the clients, before they get an IP address on our network, to check to be sure that they've got an antivirus software and that the updates are on and that the system is up to date. About as much as you can do. If it's not, allows you to put them on a different network so that they can update their system to the point that would allow them to get onto your system. Security is implemented by default. Security configuration wizard, again, I've already alluded to that, allows you to configure the security. Clustering is good for testing, migrate configuration settings. And virtualization, I think, for clustering, I have not done clustering, database clustering in it. I have done load sharing clustering. It works great. What load sharing clustering does is basically sets up a virtual IP address. We got all this virtual stuff. And when it gets there, it either sends it to one physical set of hardware or the other, depending on which one is not as busy. Quick configuration and troubleshooting, storage, performance and reliability, all the things that clustering does for you. And it does performance and reliability. To me, you still have a single point of failure, and this is just me, in clustering, because we have multiple servers running available in order to take up the load if one of them goes down. But what if your disks RAID fails? I guess that's what RAID 1.0s and RAID 5s, which RAID you're using, comes in, because you would expect that that would happen. But what they're talking about clustering here is multiple machines sharing the same storage area. Enhanced web services, we'll just say that yes, there is a web version of it. The IIS is available on all of the versions of server. If you really want to get into IIS, they print separate books for those. They used to have a separate course and a separate certification, but they've kind of taken that away. Just like they used to have a separate course, separate certification for TCP/IP, now they just expect you to know about it starting in the very first test, to be able to subnet, know about the protocols. The core minimum server, we've kind of already done that. No GUI, less disk space, smaller attack surface. Doesn't need as much hardware in order to run. Interact with it via the command line. Once you get it installed, you can use the tools and do remote management with it. And that's part of knowing about what can you do. None of this stuff is really magic. None of it's hard to do, is it? It's just a matter of knowing where it is and which checkbox to click as you go through these things. And I am a fan of, when you do these things, do you need the, and honestly, I said, why students just doing an install. Is it okay to click that? Is it, read what the window says. There's nothing mystical about much of this. Add the Windows deployment service, which you got to do in one of the, probably, I don't know if it's in 2 or 3. Well, yeah, they got about 100 steps. Not really, but probably about 50 steps. Read what the wizard says. It's going to tell you an awful lot. Then if you have a question, you can go to TechNet or one of those other places and find the answer. What I'm trying to do is not to tell you not to use those tools, but don't get so engrossed in can I click next that you lose sight of the bigger picture of what's going on. Because nothing in Windows is really all that difficult. You just got to know where to go. Sometimes if you make registry changes, you really want some assurance that that goes on. Command line interface, PowerShell, separate service, separate function, start from the all programs, start PowerShell, you get a GUI. It's a nice pretty blue GUI, or GUI window, command prompt window that allows you to do that, to run the commandlets. Common administration task, 130 command line tools in it. Scripting language, this is just using the get whatever, and they've got a couple of minor activities for you to look at just to see what this thing does. It is a much more powerful scripting capability. Virtualization, you can read about that. It's there. It's available. We're not going to be virtualizing because we're running on a virtual machine. We're going to install one without virtualization. Hyper-V is more efficient than the one that we're using, Server 2005 R2, because it runs between the hardware and the operating system, a thin layer. The one that we're using is a piece of software that runs on top of the operating system. Yes?
Hyper-V, does that have anything to do with the hyper-threading?
No, Hyper-V is virtualization. Hyper-threading is in the processor, is it not?
I never really quite understood the whole thing with the hyper-threading.
Hyper-threading allows multiple threads. You can go back and watch that part of the lecture that you missed.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it first.
Enables fast migration from one computer to the other, and this is an advantage. When we shift servers today, if it goes smoothly, I should be able to, Chris should be able to, because he's going to have to do the work. We have a bunch of machines that are on an iSCSI partition. iSCSI is SCSI connected via the network. We should be able to take it off the one server, put it on the other server, and all of that stuff come back. I'll have to add the machines into the new management console, but should just be able to go from one to the other real quickly. The machine that you're going to use was the machine that to do the install was the machine that the lab class used the last time in order to do their installs. I just copied it from the old server to the new server. So if you want to move one from one to the other, you can do that. If we have this thing set up with clustering and we have an issue, it will migrate from one machine to the other. It migrates management and migrate the storage area. On this one, some of the storage we're actually moving. Some of it are moving it to new storage. Some of it we're just moving the storage, moving the connection to the new machine. So virtualization does allow a lot of flexibility. Reliability, kernel runs in privilege mode, core programs, the computer code, the operating system, extra level security. Privilege mode, supposed to mean that we're not going to be able to disturb it, and we're not going to have as many failures. We're also not going to be able to impact it with viruses and those sorts of things. Protected processes protects premature interruption, and I guess that's true, but all of the interruption I ever try to do, and if I tell it to turn the program off, it says, do you want to turn it off or let Windows find a solution? And I say turn it off. It says, let me see if I can find a solution anyway. But it does tend to run more smoothly. Server 2008. The wizards, the reliability and performance monitor, we're talking the same one as we got in Windows 7. A lot of that stuff is going to be the same. Second look at a number of things. First look at some other things. So some of the stuff we don't have to cover in these. View running processes, and there's some activities. Multitasking, the ability to run 2 or more programs at the same time. Multithreading, the capability of programs written to run several program code blocks at the same time. Back to the run out of gas and there's 4 people in the car.
Start pushing.
Who? All of them?
No, 3 of them.
3 of them. That's multi-threading. We're trying to accomplish the same task. Now that's not exactly, obviously not technically correct, but hopefully visualizing what's going on. Preemptive multitasking, preemptive and cooperative multitasking goes back a long way. Cooperative multitasking was that programs were written so that they share the resources, we hoped. If somebody wrote one that was bad and didn't share the resources, tied up the processor, you tied up the processor. Preemptive, and that goes back to in DOS. In DOS, when you did Control-Alt-Delete, what happened? Restarted.
Yeah.
What about in these new machines? What happens when you get Control-Alt-Delete? What do you get?
Shut down.
Shut down. How about Task Manager? Task Manager then allows you to go in and preempt certain processes. That's kind of where we're going with these things. But what actually happens in preemptive multitasking, each of the processes priority changes every clock cycle so that every process gets some CPU time. So that's a continuous process of goes up, 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 up. Oh, I got some time now. I go back down to the bottom. The way that you give the highest priority is you click on it, you get the nice blue bar, and you make it the active window. That's the one that gets most of the processor. Networking model, peer-to-peer networking. I'm going to leave these since you've already had networking for your perusal in the book. Some nice pictures here. Networking across continents. Yeah, we kind of looked at that, done that. Serial connections in routers, those areas. Peer-to-peer networking, computer to computer. No special computer to network management, centralized. One of the things to really do peer-to-peer work group network management is decentralized. Good or bad, Some things are better centralized, I think network management being one of those. Back to the, if we had all you guys in here and you had to be on a single machine, but you want to share resources, we'd have to make you usernames and passwords on every computer in the room. Not such an easy task. But as it is, if we want to give you access, we just let you log on to Active Directory because we're in a domain environment. You can log on to any of the machines in the room. Computers in a domain or a work group, same place, right-click on My Computer and look at the properties of it. It'll tell you what you're in. Server-based, many users at once, advantages, single logon, and I think we probably have beaten that one to death in a number of classes. And we'll do those things in here. The protocols, this is the point I said I'm probably just going to go through because we've done that. We've done the OSI model. We've done IPv4. We've looked at a little bit, talked about IPv6, kind of know what it looks like, and that's about where you are, where we all are. All of these IPv6 things are. It's kind of like, what does a valid address look like? Not a lot of testing on them. TCP, LAN, connection-oriented, connectionless, been there. The IP protocol, dotted quad, all of those things, IPv4 and IPv6, router connects the networks. By the way, there is, and when we go on the private networks that we're using, there is a router. If you're at home sometime and golly, all of a sudden you can't get off, see if you can ping the default gateway. If you can't, you should be able to see the router. See if the router's running. If it's not, just restart it. Because when the server does updates automatically and reboots, it puts everything, all the machines, in save state. So if it happens and you're trying to get off and you can't, take a look and see if the router is actually routing. All of those things that we love. Unicast, one-to-one. Multicast, one-to-many. One of the things that multicast comes into play into this, one of the areas that it comes into play into this, is if we're doing PXE installs, Windows Deployment Service installs, you can set up a multicast environment so that machines join the multicast, and if they don't get all of the downloads the first time, they wait and get the rest of it and then do the installs. So it's available. And then broadcast to all points, sends it to all points on the network. Subnet mask tells us how long the network portion of the address is. 127.0.0.1, NAT, PAT. Again, we talked about all of those. You have configured all of those. It is much easier to do in Windows, I will say that, because all you do is add the protocol and say, oh, do it. That's something that we'll talk about in infrastructure when we add routing remote access, in-depth and DNS and those kinds of things. But it is available. IPv6, 128-bit address, static addressing. You will use static addressing because servers don't really like to be dynamic, particularly when you try to add some services. And one of the things that they have you do, and you're going to have to put, it will put, I think they have you put Active Directory on. When you do Active Directory, it's going to put DNS on. DNS doesn't like to be on a dynamic address because it's kind of tough to assign dynamic address as a DNS address. So the lab tells you what to set your address for. It's like, I'm not even going to get it. It's like 20 plus a server number or something like that. Yes?
From what I noticed, and this is from experience, is that if you don't have an IP address, or if you don't have an IP address for your DNS, when you configure, like when you go into the TCP IP at the country, if you don't put that address in there, you cannot get onto the domain. Yep.
Yeah, that goes back to what I said early on, wasn't it? That if you don't got DNS working, you might as well give up on Active Directory. You might as well quit now. Just like back in the subnetting, if you think you can subnet without writing a binary, you might as well quit now. If you think you can make Active Directory work without DNS working right, you might as well quit now. No, it has to have the correct one in there. And there's a number of ways around that. That's why it's really important that you know how, and I've got a couple of how-to videos on DNS that I'll put into the course It's really important that you know how DNS works before Active Directory is going to work for you. You'll fight it and fight it and fight it, and then all of a sudden it'll work and you don't know why.
Or you'll get like multiple IP addresses being used at once.
Well, that always happens. Dynamic addressing, DHCP, this is what we don't want on our servers but do want on our workstations, typically. That's what DNS does. Dynamic DNS allows the machines to automatically register themselves in DNS so that when they get onto the network, it says, here I'm RKE-room 111-001, and this is my IP address. Automatically lists itself in to DNS so that we don't have to know what the address is. All we need to know is the name. And we just did that, by the way. If you go to virtualpc.skyline.edu, you're going to find a whole new server. All we did was change the IP address, left the listing the same in DNS. Go to a whole new place. You get to a whole new world there, Trevor?
Yeah, it's like only 2 pages.
It's like, like 2 pages. Yeah. Can you see the CIS 2510 machines?
Yeah.
Oh, good. That means that so far permissions are okay. So DHCP allows those things to happen. Default gateway. If you don't have a default gateway, you're going no place but your local network. Default gateway if you need to go someplace else. DNS we've talked about. DNS is a really, really, really big deal. Yeah, I know. The 13 servers. What is it? DNSservers.org or something like that has got a list. Root servers. I did that wrong one time. And if you do it wrong, you get a porn site.
Yeah, Virtualization.
It's root servers, right?
Yeah.
Root-servers?
Yeah.
Root-servers.org.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you look there, it shows you where those 13 servers are all over the world. It ain't just 13 servers. It's services. There are lots of servers that are available. NetBIOS names, theoretically, and it really kind of, I guess, disturbs me a little bit that they keep talking about wins in Server 2008, because I think when you go and look at the services, you don't find wins. You have to configure DNS to use what they call a single name lookup, and it will work effectively as a NetBIOS name server. But Windows doesn't need this. What needs this are applications that run on our networks. Dynamic DNS, ARP. Take a look at ARP. They've got a nice picture in there, and I think I asked you a question, how does ARP work? ARP is one of those things that's a real problem in IPv4, and not such a problem in IPv6 because it doesn't exist. But ARP is the way that we can spoof a lot of stuff. ARP is the way we become a man in the middle. Because if I'm doing that and become a man in the middle, what if I up here on my machine told all you guys that I was the default gateway? Where would you send all your traffic going out of the room?
Your machine.
To my machine, and then what I do? I'm going to get your credit card number. And then I'm going to send the traffic on its way.
Yeah, you could easily do that with ICS.
You can easily do that, yeah. You can easily do that with a piece of software called Can't-Enable, which we use in just as a demonstration. It's not anything as complex. There's a number of ways to do it. That's just the one that I found the easiest to do to demonstrate what goes on in that process. So this is something that is not got the same weakness in IPv6 that it had in IPv4. MAC addresses should be unique. And by the way, if you want to find a troubleshooting problem that you're probably never going to troubleshoot, put a bunch of machines. I did this once on virtual machines. Put a bunch of machines on the same network have the same MAC address.
Oh God.
Sometimes it gets there and sometimes it doesn't. And finally, you do an ARP-A and say, hey, all these computers have the same MAC address. Because if you move them, it keeps the MAC address, and this is in the virtual PC software. If you copy them, it'll create a new MAC address for them, the dynamic MAC address. The ones that you use should all have unique MAC addresses because they're configured for dynamic MAC instead of fixed MAC, static MAC. Okay, and this is the ARP picture, and it's the same one that's in the book. But take a look at that. ARP process is something that you really do need to know about. Enabling TCP and verifying it's enabled. Well, yeah, it's enabled, because if you can get anywhere, and is it enabled? Look at IP config. It's going to tell you an awful lot about that. Static or dynamic addressing. You've done that. A PIPA, automatic private IP addressing 169.254.255.255 with no default gateway, which means that you actually can communicate using that on your same network, but you can't get out of the network. 169.254 means that your workstation is configured to get a DHCP address, but it can't find a DHCP server. Simple as that. So the additions, what we looked at is the additions. Drink with a fire hose. I'll give you another one here in a few minutes. Security clustering, those kinds of things, what's available in a peer-to-peer server-based networking. Server-based networking can also be a work group environment, but you still have centralized, which is different from a domain environment where you have a single database for multiple resources. If we did server-based networking and we had two servers not in Active Directory, we'd have to make a list of users, a set of users on each of the servers, just like we would have to on the workstations. So domain, peer-to-peer, computer-to-computer, server-based can still be in a workgroup environment. Domain-based, a single database that manages multiple resources. Like in here, we've got a couple domain controllers. We've got a couple different servers that you use. You use your network, your Active Directory credentials to get on the virtual PC server, right? Virtual PC, Roanoke / your network username and your network password at home. Here it automatically authenticates you because the browsers are configured to automatically authenticate with the credentials that you logged on as. That's why you don't have to do any of that here. It's the way that you configure whatever you configure. Are there questions with the introduction? Let's take a break and then we'll do chapter 1 and then we'll get into the lab.